So it's come to this. Welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, Pingers has chosen a discussion about the idea of a metagame, mostly as it relates to PvE games. Pingers says, the concept of metagame, as well as metagame perception, and how it might be managed to improve or worsen our experience of a game. I'm particularly interested in how you think of it in regards to primarily PvE games. PvP metas are a great discussion too, but I think raise a few of their own complications like player skill involvement and rock, paper, scissors dynamics. I think that's a good insight. Before we go further, I'd like to discuss some definitions that you might use for metagame. And we'll try to relate them to PvE. I think how these different interpretations of the idea of the metagame applied to PvE and PvP are different. So we'll talk about them. Basically, I think there are kind of three categories at play here. People often use the term metagame to mean different things while thinking that they mean the single correct definition of metagame. People don't agree on what that is, which is not very different from there not being a single correct definition of metagame. But I'm going to try to talk about the ones I can think of, just as many as I can think of. Metagame in general might refer to what players think about a game, but when the word metagame or meta is used, it usually evokes what players think about a game's choices and generally how good they are relative to each other, kind of regardless of whether that really applies to the game that much. But that is often what's implied. If I sent you a post about a game's meta and you didn't know anything else, you would expect that post to be a tier list, probably. Or, I don't know, somebody popping off about how it used to be better or it's bad this season or something. Anyway, I think there are kind of three common ways that the idea of a meta is thought of. I think when people think about metagame or say metagame, they usually are thinking one of these things and don't know exactly or couldn't quite articulate that, but they are referring to one of or a combination of these three things. The perception of a game by the players, the actual state of the game, which we can't really access on its own, but objective things about the game, and I'm going to call this one developer intent, or the voice of the developer. Perception first, the easiest, most obvious one. The player's thoughts about the game. Usually, I would refer to metagame as a balance of what players think about a game and what is actually true about a game, but we just can't know that by itself. We can't know what players think about a game on its own either, because we are hopefully actually playing this game too. So those things are always kind of combined, but the influence or the pull of each of them, I do think that's something we can kind of pair out. A game's design might be a pull of the actual game, and some popular player saying a thing about a game might be a player perception of a game, or a popular post on a website about the game or something. Player perception of a game does often rely a lot on what is kind of memeable or what has natural selected to be considered good advice. It's not the advice that is the most good, if there even is such a thing in this game. It's the advice that is the most common, basically. The advice that was evolved, like in natural selection, to be the most repeatable. Generally, this means that popular perception of a game will be not incorrect reduction of the game's actual state, or a distillation, maybe. You won't be very successful in these games if you only use the popular recommendations, but you will be a lot more successful than if you pick something at random. They're good suggestions, just not very complete. Generally, if a build, for example, is commonly recommended in a PvE game, it's a good idea. It might be surprisingly not the best or one of the better ideas for anyone, but it's just very foolproof. It's something that would be effective anywhere, just not great advice if you literally use only it everywhere. It's a good piece of go-to or fallback advice, maybe. This is a weird way to give an example of this, but when I DM Dungeons & Dragons, something I do to help my players speed along their turn is, I don't want to force them to have to, pick an action if they run out of time, to keep the game moving. So what we do is they pick a basic action, like I'm going to attack or I'm going to hide or I'm going to flee or whatever, at the very beginning of their turn very quickly. They don't have to do that thing. Then they get a timer to come up with something they'd rather do. And if they can't, well, they did pick some basic thing that they are okay with doing. I kind of think of it that way. That action might not be the best option, but it's something vaguely appropriate for the situation. Are they trying to be aggressive or more defensive or passive, or they're hiding or something? In general, they do something that will move them forward in that direction. It might just not be the best option or as good as something else they could come up with. And of course, it's D&D. There is no best option. They're just trying to come up with something they'd find more, basically more fun, more interesting, maybe more effective for a certain thing. They don't really know. But they have a basic option that is efficient and kind of foolproof, right? This is how I think of the perception of a game's metagame. It's quite useful as long as you consider it to be what it is, a small part of the reality of a game, not the players telling you the correct answer to the game. There is no correct answer anyway, and that certainly isn't it. But I think it's a really helpful component as long as it's put in context, something PNGRZ gets into later in the parlay. The second thing, this is the actual state of the game. Again, you can't really access that by itself, but it'll make more sense when I get to this third thing. For now, think of the actual state of the game as, if we weren't biased by the flow of history and individuals influencing us to play certain builds, influencing the community, to play certain builds more, what might people gravitate to more than they otherwise would? Or you could say like what's currently being slept on or forgotten in the community. Just like people have a tendency to idolize things that are popular when really those are neither good nor bad, they're just very natural selected ideas. People also have a tendency to fetishize being a total hipster and enjoying things merely because they are not popular, which personally I think if you take a long look at yourself, you will stop doing. But if you find it fun, that's totally fine. I just think it's not good, bad, unhelpful when people insist on arguing that the thing is inherently for not just them, good or bad, because it is or is not popular. It isn't. That is wrong. But yeah, and it's wrong because it's not helpful. You are later going to ask me what I think a healthy meta looks like, and this is kind of part of that answer. I think that the kind of objective state of the game, it might just seem like, but what is that though? Because you can't really have it by itself. Will make more sense when I talk about the kind of developer intent. Here's an example. In Magic the Gathering, there's a very popular type of deck called tribal decks. These are what they sound like. An elf deck, a goblin deck, a dragon deck. If you've been playing Magic in the last 2 years, it's probably a dragon deck, okay? Anyway, dragons have been popping off lately. I'm getting a bit sick of that, but there's some really interesting... you guys read Mirim, the Sentinel Worm, that commander? What? Why? No, stop. Why did they make that? Bad. What? Read that card. Like, pause this and go read that card. What the hell? Mirim? It's a red, blue, and green dragon commander. What? Why did they make that? Anyway, ridiculous. Tribes. And why is Mirim so ridiculous? Well, this card is what is often referred to as a lord or a payoff, a tribal dragon card. It gives you some benefit when you play more dragons. Traditionally, lords are just a creature that gives all your other creatures of that type a power and toughness boost. They just get stronger. So if you make a deck that has a lot of support, dragons, elves, goblins, you can play a lot of lords, and many of your cards make most of your other cards stronger. This means your deck has a lot of synergy, it can get a lot of momentum going, and it's kind of resistant to disruption, because if they destroy any one of your cards, well, most of them synergize, most of them buff up the other cards. So it's interesting, and it can be really fun to play a novel tribe, especially when the designers do a good job of giving that tribe some character. For example, elves often make a lot of mana, or kind of snowball. The more of them you get, the more mana you make. Goblins are often rather self-sacrificing and really fast. They do have some character. Merfolk, different colors of merfolk tribal have kind of different flavor to them. They can be a bit tricksy, which is interesting. A bit of unblockability sub-theme. It's fun, I think the most fun, when the different tribes have some mechanical flavor. They are relatively more similar, I think, And like dragons is such a huge tribe in all colors in Magic that I don't think it feels that distinct. But the game does still say things about what that tribe is like. And to get back to this metagame point, you might be saying, how is this different from what the players think about a tribe? Dragons are very popular because people just like them and think they're good. They, I think, are correct that they're good. Mirim Sentinel Worm is a totally busted card that is available in the game, and if you play it, you will literally just win because it's ridiculously powerful. Okay, so what's this thing? Well, you might open a pack of Magic cards and see a Lord for a tribe. Let's say you open a pack of Amonkhet or Hour of Devastation, I forget which, and you open that one Minotaur Lord. Minotaurs don't have a lot of tribal cards that do something for all Minotaurs or related to Minotaurs. There are a few. A few of them are pretty crazy, but not very many. There are not a lot of them. But opening that one pack and seeing that one rare that is your Minotaur Lord, you, a Magic the Gathering player, might think, are Minotaurs a tribe? Why is there this Minotaur tribal card? Are there a lot of Minotaurs in this set? Can I make a Minotaur deck? I want to make a Minotaur deck, you know? In that moment, you might not know, if you magically injected every single Magic card into your head, that there actually aren't that many Minotaur tribal cards. There aren't none. You might be able to do it, don't get me wrong. Just an example. But there are quite a few tribes in Magic that for one reason or another, they made a Lord for that tribe, but like literally only one. There's just some obscure, like weird Lord card for that tribe. Or there are tribes like Oozes that have more support than you'd think, but I don't know if it's like enough, you know, to make it feel like an Ooze deck. I'd love to see that if you feel like there is. I looked at it and thought, nah, I don't know. There's more than one card, but I don't know. I find this really interesting, sure, if this was about Magic the Gathering. But what this is a useful example of is the developer kind of suggesting that that is or isn't a thing that you could or couldn't do. After all, the developer has their own experience of the game and their own thoughts about what its meta might be. They have a little of the perception thing, a lot of the actual state of the game thing, because of course they designed it. They know the stuff in it. They just don't have as much or the same practice like iterating it. So they're going to suggest certain things and kind of see what happens. And I think that's an unsung factor. Doing a little bit of a plug, I think this is the not the celebrity of the group, the way that perception is, the way that popularity is, and also not the number crunching workhorse that like the actual state of the game is. I think this kind of developer intention thing is a surprisingly important aspect of a game that a lot of people don't notice that much. It can be hard to notice. It's quiet over there in the corner, subtly influencing the politics of the game. But it is a big deal. Developers, I think you should care about this thing more. I think sometimes they do. They know it has a big effect. But yeah, I think it matters a lot. It's interesting. I'll try to give more examples as we go. But for now, yeah, that word cloud of things about a game's meta. Again, I think in PvP games, perception of a game affects you more because you have it inflicted upon you. Even if you don't care at all about the perception of a game, your opponent is going to wield it against you in combat. That is what PvP is. So, yeah, like if there are choices in the game and it is PvP, and I gather you're talking about buildcraft metagames, if the game is a game with meaningful choices of some kind, even if it's just like a fighting game where you pick a character, not very buildcrafty, the metagame matters quite a bit as far as perception because you're, you know, gonna be attacked by that thing. The objective state of the game also matters a lot, is very visible in a PvP buildcraft game because your build is live fire tested against other people every time you play. That's what PvP is. Whereas in a PvE game, I think what defines the metagame is that it is unsubstantiated. It's often very, very difficult to test things in any meaningful way in a PvE metagame. Now, before I move on to the next part of this parlay, I also want to mention something. I've been really focusing on this topic a lot recently about the dynamic of a buildcraft game's balance and how it relates to PvE metagame thoughts about that game. In general, I think that the relationship between a game's buildcraft and a game's like metagame mattering is inverse. The more a game's metagame matters, that is, the more you need to use the things that are or are perceived as good, the less build crafty the game tends to be, because the degree to which a metagame actually matters is the degree to which you need to use more powerful things, the degree to which the exact level of power matters. But games that offer a lot of buildcraft will tend to loosen that nut. That balancing will not be quite so tight. Not anything will do. They're going to make you pick something good to some extent. Otherwise, there would be no point in choosing anything, because literally anything would work well. Some people might enjoy that, but a lot of people who want to make builds do want some level of challenge. To use a metaphor, they want to play tennis with the net up. They want a net there. You're like not even really playing tennis otherwise. But they don't want, if they hit the ball off the top of the net, that counts in normal tennis. But if the ball hits the line and you're like, is it in, is it out? You're not really sure. That's a rule in normal tennis. But you know what I mean? Most buildcraft, it's better if you just say, let's just say it's in. Let's not worry about exactly where it landed. Let's just say that's close enough. Whereas in competitive tennis, like it's in or it's out, check the camera footage, Competitive games where the metagame matters a lot more tend to be the check the camera footage thing. Whereas the build crafting games tend to say, that's close enough, like if we're not sure. Because it makes it easier for there to be meaningful choices that will still work. You don't have to worry about a difference in damage so minor that the player won't even notice, 5 or 10% damage output that the player wouldn't notice or maybe think twice about. But in a finely balanced game, that would then cause you to lose, even though it doesn't seem like the thing is appreciably better or worse to the player. So even if you think it's desirable for there to be difficulty, buildcraft games have an incentive to only make the game's balance tight to the degree that the player even notices that they're using something more or less powerful. Because otherwise it feels like you might even not know why you're losing. So it is a bad design decision regardless of the player's desire for difficulty. That being said, you'll notice, as a simple example, that a game like Final Fantasy XIV, in a raid in Final Fantasy XIV, you do relatively need to do enough damage. So the game eliminates a factor. There really aren't buildcraft decisions in that game, because it means that as long as you play the game effectively, you can't have just invisibly picked something that does 3% less DPS and make the whole team lose, for a reason you might just not even know, you might not even find out. It's not a good decision. Warframe is a game where it matters less, exactly how much you could argue, and I don't really care either way, how much damage you do. And as a result, you have a lot more choices, and you can make a lot of choices that are not the same as other people's choices and still clearly get everything done. The game does objectively care less about how much damage you do. Exactly how much, well, that's that perception element of the meta, right? But I do think it's critical to keep in mind how buildcraft affects how much the metagame basically matters. As I said at the top of the parlay, I think it's very useful to think of a game's popular or perception style buildcraft recommendations as being a meaningful part of the metagame. They're not wrong or anything, but they are kind of the oversimplification version. A point I'd like to continue to now is that when you discuss the meta in a buildcraft focused game, you should keep in mind that the value of a generally useful recommendation is reduced because you don't need it as much. If the game was more tightly balanced and there was a generally applicable recommendation that worked, that recommendation is a larger part of all the possible viable builds in a game that is more tightly balanced. So the less tightly balanced the game is, the less valuable a general recommendation is, because you just don't need it. More things would do. It's still a useful starting point, but when considering maybe what you're going to use, I'm often asked this when I'm doing live shows on Twitch, and I often try to say, it depends what you want. The community's probably going to recommend this perception thing. They're going to recommend Glaive Prime as a throwing weapon. And they're going to recommend that because, we're going to the objective thing, it forces slash when you explode it with a heavy attack. It hits in a large area. It's got good supplemental stats. By the way, I think that's about 15% crit, 15% status as a rule of thumb, blah, blah, blah. And I might say, well, the designers also have put some glaives in, this kind of designer intention thing, that do other things. So if you would value having an infinite combo counter, well, there's a glaive like that. So it's not that the Glaive Prime is the best at everything, but if you don't want those things, then it's good, and this is why. So to get into the discussion of what a healthy meta looks like, I think it's important to keep in mind how buildcraft tends to make meta matter less, which means it might be useful to discuss these games a certain way. I hope this feels connected. I hope that makes sense. Pinger says, what does a healthy meta look like? Is there a more or less positive way to approach the discussion of a game's meta? Hopefully you see how that's related now. If we accept that we'll never have the full grasp of a game's actual meta because we can't see it by itself, this objective game thing, is there a better way to be wrong, because we cannot possibly be right, about a game's meta as a community rather than just saying, yeah, we don't know if there's a best thing? Yeah, I think so. Where I'm going with this, of course, is that since there is a loosey-goosey requirement for like the exact most effective thing, and because you are going to still get a natural selected popular request that is understood to be, people are going to say it's the best thing. When people then ask, or when you're looking yourself, it's better not to dismiss the popular thing. Yeah, it has been reduced in value by the game having a lot of build options and being less tightly balanced, but I think it's important not to throw it out. It's a useful starting point. Some people don't want to focus on the build parts of a game with significant buildcraft. That could be an easy way for them to just get that out of the way, and that's fine. Again, I think because you don't know which of the many reasons somebody is operating under when they ask for advice about a game, maybe they're baiting you into saying something they can then say is stupid. That's an obnoxious thing people do. How will you know? Maybe they are having trouble completing missions and they want help. Maybe they really do want the biggest damage numbers and they just don't know how to get that. Maybe they've been misled into believing that's important in this game. Maybe that is important in this game. Who knows, you know? Not only do they probably not know, you don't know. Maybe it is important to have the biggest numbers in this game. Maybe because you've been making builds that are really good, you haven't noticed how useful it is to have big damage in this game, leading you to possibly wrongly claim that it doesn't really matter that much when it kind of does in most people's experience, and you just don't know. So it's much better to give a sort of omni answer, in my opinion. This is how I approach it on my live shows, and for what it's worth, this is literally my job. So this works better than a lot of other approaches I've heard. Maybe there's an even better way to do it. I don't know. But I do highly recommend this. This is the actionable piece of the parlay. I think that you should give that type of recommendation I gave before. Give all the perspectives. Say what you perceive the perception of the game to be. You know, again, they want a glaive. What's the biggest damage glaive in Warframe or whatever? That was a question I got asked. Shout out to whoever asked that question. That was a really helpful example. Thank you. There's no shame in asking that question. By the way, who knows or cares why you were asking it? That's fine. My job is to give you an answer. And the answer I tried to give was, well, the community's perception is that it's glaive prime. Again, there's the perception part. Don't try to resist that. It's a good recommendation for a reason. Don't argue that natural selection failed. It didn't. Because here are the reasons. Well, if it is a good suggestion, well, why? And for a person like you're talking to me who wants an actual reason for the thing, now you've done that while also appeasing the person who just wants the simple answer. It does the / and whatever. I said this before. And then you can also go down here and say, well, there is other design space in the game. And remember, no player knows all builds. So don't try to. Maybe look at the other glaives and say, well, it's conceivable that there would be a situation where this one would be useful because it does have a different benefit. Glaive Prime doesn't give you infinite combo. If that were to matter, this could be better. I don't know. No one knows if it is better. There isn't really a way to do that, but this one has a different benefit. Does that matter to you? Is that useful to you? Are you planning to use it for normal attacking instead of throwing? There are these other glaives that have these innate damage types and still good supplemental stats. They don't have the benefit of doing the glaive prime force / explosion thing, but if you're not going to do that, if you're instead going to normal attack with it, auto attack, you might wish to use combos and pick the Serrata or that other one that has the innate viral. The Serrata has innate toxin. There's another one with innate viral. Because they might be similarly good if you're just going to do combo attacks. Again, the person will almost certainly not specify which of these pieces of information they want, but you lose nothing by answering them. You're still taking the time to probably, if it's you typing up a comment to a stranger on the internet, this isn't worth your time really. You're just trying to talk about the game. take the time to give, you know, the full kit and caboodle answer, right? That's what I think. So, yeah, I mean, I think rather than assuming, it's better to take the shotgun approach. The healthy metagame discussion looks like that, I think. Not assuming why the person wants an answer, not assuming what the point of the game is. If you think you have a thing that is the point of the game, and you probably have arguments for why that is the point of the game, you will say something like, in Dungeons and Dragons, the point of the game is role playing. After all, that's what it does that other games don't. You could play a role-playing game on the computer, but it isn't open-ended in the same way as D&D, so the point of D&D is this thing. I just explained why, but that's still not the right answer in any meaningful way. If you just want to be right, you can be rhetorical all you want, but if someone else is enjoying the game and they're not using it that way, they're not somehow wrong. Their fun is not somehow wrong, if they're not harming anyone else anyway. And yes, in a very, very long-term perspective, maybe that way of enjoying the game is less efficient, but no one can know that. It's not useful to argue that. Don't argue that. That's my other piece of advice. Instead, try to cater to all of the ways of enjoying the game that you can think of. If you can think of a way to enjoy D&D by mathing the hell out of it, but you think that's an invalid way to enjoy the game, recommend that way of enjoying the game, with that caveat that you're saying, if you want to math the hell out of it. Like, just let people decide for themselves. Let me put it a different way. If you're so right, there's no need to argue that your point is correct. You can just state as many options as possible and it'll work out. Likewise, I think the healthy metagame community also is characterized by people who do this on a more micro level. When somebody says something in a community and you think, wow, that's really bad, that's going to give people the wrong idea or a bad idea, or it'll make the community worse or whatever, you can't convince people that that person is wrong. It just won't work. You can say answers, reasoning all you want until you're blue in the face, but it won't work. Don't do it. It's pointless. It's a waste of your breath. Don't spend the calories typing it. Instead, just say your experience as a subjective, non-factual experience. This is more effective than trying to argue that that person didn't have the experience they did have and will never give up on. You should instead just give a counterpoint. And if your point is so right, don't worry. The natural selection of memes will make it rise to the top. There's no need to kind of prove it with an argument. That does in fact make it less likely to become the accepted sentiment about the game. If a bunch of reasonable people non-enthusiastically state their opinions about a thing, that game's community will improve. I doubt this will happen for any games. There's a reason that the kinds of people who spend their time on online forums are often not so productive. That's not random, you know? At the same time, yeah, I mean, you're not making it worse. So that's a recommendation. Okay, so those were some thoughts. And to summarize, you did say a healthy meta, not just a better ways to approach discussion of a game's meta, or a way for a community to discuss meta in a game. I think, in short, a healthy meta, this is even simpler, is mostly just good buildcraft for a buildcraft game that we're talking about metagaming for. If the game has a variety of like obvious and non-obvious, niche and general options that are good, pretty much if the game has meaningful buildcraft, I think that's essentially the same as it having a healthy meta. There are differences. Meta does include, I think, more of than when you talk about buildcraft, like the perception of the game. So a healthy meta also needs to be a game where it's either clear enough that things are effective in different ways, or the community has accepted many different ways of playing, maybe one or the other. To some extent, I wonder about Warframe's decision to show players the stats on the Warframes people are using. It's got a lot of different benefits and drawbacks, but one thing it makes me think is you may, I'm not sure, but there may have been the illusion, correct or not, that Warframe use was more even until they showed us that it isn't. You see what I mean? And I would argue that if this is an oversimplification, but if you had a game where people wrongly believed that people more evenly used the options in the game, but then they found out that they didn't evenly use the options in the game. That causes, I don't think that would cause anything other than people using different options even less. You know what I mean? Like, I would argue that that very act makes the game's metagame less healthy, because part of the meta is what people perceive it to be. If people's perception is changed from a more diverse to a less diverse perception, I guess the metagame got less healthy. I would argue that merely saying that the metagame is less healthy is the metagame being less healthy in some way. That sounds weird. It sounds like how before you can't have the objective form of the game by itself, but the perception of the game is some of the reality of the game experience. So I think that does happen. I don't know. I therefore think it is worth trying not to focus on what the best standout things are, because it is usually not relevant to these games, and I would argue it makes them worse. If a game has the option for you to focus on things that do more damage and not focus on that, focusing on the things that do the more damage and then glorifying that thing does make the game's meta less diverse, which arguably makes the game worse. This is a subject I've been very frustrated about over the years, and I've been trying to take a chill pill about over the years. I got very frustrated when recording a previous take of this parlay about how, yeah, from my perception, like a lot of games have kind of been ruined by the player's perception of the game kind of eating it alive. The example I'll give is League of Legends. This is a game where if you find a useful way to approach a character, but it's not considered to be a useful way to approach the character, the community is so invested in the actions of others because it affects them, because the game's design causes it to affect them. They will, harass and maybe even report and get banned a player that is not using a thing that is perceived as being good. Whether the thing is actually good has arguably ceased to exist in that community. It doesn't matter anymore. It is superseded. The only thing that matters anymore is if it's perceived as being good. Or if that's all very nebulous, then it could maybe matter. If your teammates are all just not popping off, maybe it's okay. I'm not saying you will instantly get banned for doing anything that is not perceived as a popular build. Of course, obviously not. And at higher levels like professional play in League of Legends, this is just an example. Like, obviously that's different. But I do think it's interesting to consider how large of an effect player perception can have on a game's metagame. A lot of the time in PvP, but even in PvE games, like in Warframe, where a player might think that somebody else who they can see is using a certain weapon that they don't think is good is maybe wasting their time because the mission will go more slowly or whatever. People also tend, as I kind of finish out the parlay, to do something I call preventative buildcraft, or the correlation equals causation kind of thing. Related, but slightly different issues. They will, in the example of yelling at people for doing something they think is wrong, they'll see the mission failed and see that a weapon they think is bad was on one of their teammates, and that teammate was where the mission failed. So it's because of that weapon. See, they're right. How could they not be right? It looks right. When, of course, they have really no way of knowing that. No one knows all builds. Maybe the weapon is really good. They don't really know for sure. Obviously, you don't have no idea. But were they even using it that much? What was their Warframe using? Were they using some, heretofore unperceived buff that was making it do more damage? Was the mission working out differently than they expected? People blame people not knowing those things. You could theoretically know all that stuff, but people don't when they say that. They feel like it's confirming that thing. People want to understand, and these games are difficult to understand, and it feels good if you feel like you know what happened. You feel defensive of your time, and you don't want it to be ruined, and so you say the thing. I'm saying this because I think it's important to understand why people get frustrated about this. It is because they're just trying to be elitist and their thing is good and they want to make themselves feel better. But it's not only because of that. There is some legitimate reason to be frustrated about this a lot of the time, I think. Likewise, there's a parallel problem, especially in PvE buildcrafty builds. I just say builds instead of any word if I'm rushed. Where people will, I call it preventative buildcraft. They are made to believe that energy generation is a problem. And they're given a solution for what is the popular solution to the energy generation problem. They then use it all the time and don't experience the problem. So there's a problem and it works, right? Well, wait, hold on. They never actually tried without using it. They don't know if that problem's there. Maybe they're not experiencing a lack of energy because they're solving the problem. Or maybe they didn't have the problem to begin with, so they didn't need to solve it, which they now don't know because they never tried not solving it. Most people don't test things, and a lot of buildcraft games that are PvE focused don't offer a good way to test things. Remember in the beginning how I said how metagaming in PvP is more defined by perception in the sense that, and the actual essence of the game, because the game is literally about testing your thing live fire all the time to see if it does work, and success and failure is like more of a thing in those games. It's hard to know whether your thing you're doing in a PvE game is reliable. The game's focus isn't as much on testing that thing, relatively. Both PvE games and buildcraft focused games. So the meta for these games is often, again, I said earlier, kind of unsubstantiated compared to other games. It's less known whether that thing is actually useful. So as a different piece of advice for how to approach a game like this in a more effective way, I would highly recommend generally not putting things on until you've seen that you need them. It's okay, you can fail once, it's not the end of the world in these games. Just try not using the thing. Don't preemptively prevent a problem. In these games, people frequently assume a thing is a problem without ever checking, so you might be spending a lot of resources on something that doesn't actually happen when you play. I know that seems weird, but it happens all the time. Warframe is a really good example. Companions, for example. Sentinels dying when they use their weapon. This little companion on your shoulder shooting, well, isn't it drawing aggro by shooting? And then people's companions die a lot. So isn't it because it's shooting a lot? And then people kind of maybe don't, scientifically note down every single mission how often their companion dies with and without a weapon. They don't do that. I haven't done that. What I have done is use the Sentinel with a weapon equipped for thousands of hours of playing Warframe, and my Sentinel is alive at the end of most missions. So there clearly isn't really a problem here. Like, you don't need to unequip the weapon. If you're shooting actively and playing actively, you are getting targeted. I think people don't realize, I'm not sure this is why, but I think people don't realize that a lot of things in Warframe just do kill your companion. Like, even if they're not being targeted, AoE damage and stuff, for example. It's not because your companion is drawing aggro. But again, people don't test this very thoroughly, including me. So while I believe that that's not an issue, the truth is both they and I don't know. I know, what I do know is that there's utility in assuming that it isn't an issue, because I've assumed it's not an issue and found success at the thing players complain that you won't have success at if you don't do the thing. In other words, I didn't take their advice, but I appear to be no worse off. So I guess it's fine. But exactly what's happening, who knows? It's not unknowable, but people are, it's not really practical to spend our leisure time doing the science on this thing. It's better to just check both ways and see what your experience is. To finish out, Pingers says, in my experience, I've been through a lot of seemingly restrictive games, but pushing against these perceived restrictions has led me to some really interesting places in the game's buildcraft. It's possible to say that I would have found these places in the game's buildcraft, because my attitude just is that way, because I'm the kind of person who would find those things. But in the moment, I don't think I would have even approached those subjects if I wasn't actively being told basically about the meta of the game. Everyone is already doing XYZ. XYZ is fully explored and proven to be good in these situations. Yeah, this could mean two things. It could be a statement about how I wouldn't have tried a thing unless I got other people's advice that it was good, or I wouldn't have responded to a thing and looked for different good things if people didn't insist that there was nothing else to find, which I know is wrong because of this Parley discussion. If people are saying this game is solved, you immediately know it isn't. That's not really possible. There are very simple games in life that are solved, but generally these games are not only just not mathematically solved yet, but they're designed not to be meaningfully solvable. Even if you knew the weapon you could somehow perfectly simulate every playstyle, every mission, every situation, and claim that a weapon was objectively the strongest weapon, we've established that buildcraft games are designed for that to not matter. So it doesn't, relatively less anyway. It's not irrelevant, but you don't need to use that weapon. You don't find appreciably more success by picking that instead of something else, unless the game is in very dire straits and needs to be patched. So there is no game being solved. That can't exist. Like that is impossible. And so whenever you will hear that in most games, people will say, yeah, we largely understand what is good in this game, even when that's either blatantly ridiculous or relatively plausible. Genshin Impact week 1, we know which characters are good. You obviously don't. What? People aren't even at the end of the game. Like, clearly that doesn't mean anything. But after a few years, it becomes like, all right, that's not a ridiculous sounding claim, but you're still wrong because that's just not possible. People just have a more useful, natural selected general opinion about the thing. But it's really useful to keep in mind that since it's not even possible to have solved a thing for sure, you might as well try. You know there's something under there. You will find something interesting. I have a lot of good experiences with this. Now, you said you hoped to hear a bit about the experiences I've had, and I gave a lot of little examples. I'm not sure. I thought about a lot in the previous take as well. If I have any defining example of a situation where, like, it was widely believed that a certain thing was the only good thing or that this thing was bad, but then I played the game and had a robust experience that was not true, I guess. Don't know that I have had that experience. I can think of two things, but I don't think they're great examples. In Warframe, it has often been said that the metagame was a lot more simple than it was, and critically, that's true in every game, as we've established. But our developers have frequently patched the game as if that was true, which I know from experience it wasn't. I mean, again, it's not that I know the right thing and they don't. It was more complicated than that, which I know because I experienced it. People said you can't, do as much damage unless you use this exact type of damage, corrosive at the time, years ago, and with a crit focus build, just criticals, not status, which was not true at the time. There were plenty of situations where you would take a different approach and it did equal or much higher damage. That just wasn't commonly understood. This is all normal. Where things get weird is that Digital Extremes, to Warframe's developers, patched the game as if that was true, which it was not. And usually, it's been my experience that the developer usually isn't very wrong about the reality of the game. This was pretty different than the real state of the game. And this led to me and a lot of you folks that were following along with the Warframe Buildcraft stuff at the time, leading to the experience that the game actually became less diverse because of an update made to address a supposed lack of diversity in the game, which, I don't think it's because our developers, Digital Extremes, did something, when I say bad, mistaken. They did a thing on purpose, but to fix a problem that didn't exist, that just wasn't there. They listened to the community about something that wasn't substantiated enough by the game. You might be saying, well, but we've established that perception of the game's meta matters. It does. But relying only on it is madness. What about those other two things? So that was an experience I had, sure. Warframe weapon buildcraft has been extremely straightforward for the past couple of years, where I feel like there were little choices before that really don't exist now, for not really any gain. There's, the game has a more elegant status system, but also less of them are good. I think anyway. So not great. Hades is my other example. A lot of reviews of Hades said that they became frustrated at how, at one point in Hades' story, you must succeed at runs of Hades. Not too much, but there's an arc where that's important. After quite a while, you have time to get to grips with the game, and I think to become powerful, in a way where the game with unmodified difficulty should be doable for a lot of players, and there is a mode you can activate that simply makes you more and more powerful each time. So it's hard to argue that that is a problem for the game, but a lot of reviews said that they experienced that they got to a point in the game where it became a matter of luck whether they succeeded or failed. Now, I've played a lot of Hades past that, and we know that reviewers often don't have enough time to play more of the game. They played 50 or so hours of the game, and by that time in my time playing Hades, I had not yet learned what I later learned, which is that the game offers enough tools to make it very reliable that you will get a good build that will allow you to win, certainly at the default difficulty with the assist mode or whatever active. But people simply didn't generally discover that. Now, I'm not right and they're wrong. The fact that the game's design didn't communicate that is a critique of Hades that is valid. I think it would be better if those reviews magically knew that that was the case and said this game's design doesn't adequately critique this, demonstrate this thing. But what are you going to do? However, we have been playing a version of Hades that doesn't exist for the people that reviewed the game for the most part. The game has, I believe, robust, very controllable buildcraft, but only at a point in the game that did not become the meta perception of the game. People just didn't get there. And I think that because people assume, well, it's a review, it's the reviewers, or everybody agrees about this thing, they look at that as being the true thing rather than looking at what those people have in common and saying, but what if you didn't have that experience? Like, those people are all kind of similar data points because they had a similar experience. They played the game for only so long. What about if you do more than that? Now, again, I'm not trying to say I just said, but I'm going to say again, that's not like the correct experience of Hades. We uncovered the truth. Like, no, arguably, that's not an intended part of the experience of Hades because the game is kind of over. Some parts of the game, the story, are over before you would be likely to have harnessed those buildcraft tools. So is it an intended part of the experience? And even today, I would say, I'm not sure. Like, they did make the tools available, but it's combining all of them. I mean, you really do like everything in your power, and then it becomes a game where you can reliably do the thing. Is that reasonable to expect? Maybe they just wanted a game with relatively less randomness, and the result was a game that could be played this way. But is it useful to state that the game can be played that way? I don't really know. This is something that concerns my career a lot because I spend all day playing the game that way. A way that I know for a fact most people do not believe is even a way you can play the game, let alone a way they play it. Now, that may be interesting to people, but is it also not satisfying what people want out of Hades? Is that talking past what people were looking for in that game? I'm not really sure. And now, a lot of my goal making videos and doing the live shows is to demonstrate games that I thought had interesting, fun buildcraft so that people who want interesting, fun buildcraft can go play them. And the fact that you might not have known that Hades could provide that experience, but then I'm demonstrating that, gives you an example that you could maybe use. That's useful. But I guess what I'm getting at is that there's a level on which maybe that's inefficient. Like, you could make a lot of games maybe have meaningful buildcraft if you fiddled with them. I'll give you the example of Risk of Rain 2, a game that does some funny things with buildcraft. It gives you random items as drops, and then eventually you get an item that lets you pick what you get every time you get an item drop. So now it's got buildcraft, right? But then you realize that once you can pick whatever you want, you really peel back the curtain that every item in Risk of Rain 2 combos together into a single mega build or an omni build, which isn't really bad. That's just what the game is trying to do. I don't think that's a problem with the game. But it does kind of like no buildcraft, yes buildcraft, no buildcraft. Does do a little thing. Risk of Rain 2 has a pretty robust modding community, so you can modify the game to, I suppose, have buildcraft, among other things. Now, I have Risk of Rain 2 rather moderately modded, so that every item drop is a multi-shop. If you're not familiar with Risk of Rain 2, instead of being any random item or any chosen item, you instead get 3 choices whenever an item would drop as a chest. So you can't pick whatever you want, but you can, the functional changes, you can avoid items that would be of no benefit to you. And another big change is that items which are only good at a specific time are much better because you can see that you could get them and then choose whether they would be good. Crowbars, which give you damaged, undamaged enemies, so they're good with like burst damage or single big hits of damage. items that give you like more money, which might be more useful earlier in the game. You can pick these items if they would be good and then avoid them if they wouldn't, making them, I believe, a much more complete part of the game. And that experience, well, I don't think is very significant buildcraft. I'm using as an example here because it's like, I don't really know, who's to say? It feels like the developers, for Risk of Rain 2, Hoopu were not trying to make a game that was a buildcrafty experience. And it feels like the people making Warframe are trying to make a game that is some kind of buildcraft experience. But what about Hades? That's basically where I'm going with this. We're, you know, because I do think, since no one knows all builds, it's often better to look at whether a game is calling to that audience rather than trying to know everything about the game and then decide that way. It might be better to spend our relatively limited time on games that appear to be trying to do the thing we want well, rather than games that we know for sure are doing that thing well. It takes too long to, you don't even really know that, but to attempt to kind of know that, that just takes too long. And so I think it might be better, I think that matters. Finally, then, I think something to consider about a metagame is that a healthy perception of a metagame would try to embrace all ways a game could be enjoyed. I kind of talked about that earlier. But the key thing here is that a healthy meta of a game features a game that itself communicates very well. This bottom thing that I've kind of alluded to, this sort of developer intent thing, one reason that's important is because trying to get players to play your game for a reason you intend your game to be good sounds like it shouldn't matter at all. If people are playing Call of Duty, surely they are not like doing it wrong. I mean, is it some grand mystery what you get out of playing Call of Duty? You see what I'm trying to say? But there are a lot of games where I think subtly it's pretty unclear like what the direction for the game's development is. There are also a lot of games where part of the game is not really the intended experience, it's just kind of there. Like, I'll give you a few rapid fire examples at the end here. Is part of the intended experience of Genshin Impact gambling? Is part of the intended enjoyment of Genshin Impact gambling? Or is that just there because that's how the game makes money? Does the game like focus on gambling, or is that just part of the experience? You might have one answer or another. There is, of course, no right answer really. The game does revolve around the characters you have, and you do get them by doing a thing that is kind of gambling. You don't have to do it in a gambly way. That's purely subjective. But that's, you might say, a small part of the game. You could argue, yeah, characters are important, but you don't have to get them in a gambly way. You focus on guaranteed 5 stars, use the 4 stars you get, and just focus on the rest of the game, right? Well, but artifacts, when you get gear in that game, well, you get those randomly. But that sucks. So is that the intended part of the experience? But it is a big part of the experience. It's difficult to say. In Warframe, is buildcraft a big focus of the experience? I don't know. I think that buildcraft is an elegant way to give the players something to chew on between the game's story releases. But I think that looking at the development effort put into the game and what parts of the game are good, it's pretty clear that the developer's focus, at least to me, is on the story beats of the game, and that buildcraft is a necessary instrument to make the game be a thing between those story beats. The game would be an untenable model in its current form without buildcraft toys in each update. Now, are they just also good, even though they're not the focus? I don't know, sure. But do you see what I'm trying to say? And I do feel like one thing that gets metagames confused is that, now that I say it this way, I hope you see what I mean by, like, the point of a lot of games influences what people think about the meta, and it is surprisingly unclear what the point of a lot of games is. Hades has a beautiful, masterfully crafted buildcraft system, very interactable and reliable, that most people don't know exists or think doesn't exist. What do you even say about that relative to a game's metagame, So I think that's something to keep in mind. When people say, but this is the whole point of a game, like, that's always wrong, really. The point of the game can be, whatever. But I think it's important to really embrace how, like, it's not just subjective because people can enjoy different things. It's kind of unknown. Like, it's not fully clear a lot of the time, like what the developer is even trying to make be a good part of the game. It sometimes is, but I think a lot of the time it isn't. I think that's significant too. Um, a long parlay that I think I did bad a lot of times, but this take is, I hope, good. I hope a satisfying discussion about a topic I care a lot about. I hope you feel like you have like actionable things to do when you interact and discuss metagame topics in buildcraft focused PvE games. Be nice to each other. Try to give a shotgun approach of answers. Accept that people have different motivations. Don't try to argue against the way people are doing it. Just give your experience, and the good one will rise to the top. That's all I got. One of the reasons I decided to make this be my job and crafted a custom career for myself, spending the effort of almost an entire half-decade just to do this for a living, is because I think that Buildcraft communities do such a bad job of discussing metagames. And the greatest thing that I have ever done in my life is get the pleasure of talking to all of you so that we could have a pleasant Buildcraft metagame discussion community. So thank you for doing that. If you've been watching the live shows and talking about that with us, if you're asking parlay questions, that's a lot of that. But even just allowing me to do a thing that is a job, that is like making the Zanny Pants channel videos and Bootleg Builds channel stuff, even if it's a little bit less direct, I really appreciate it. And when you talk to each other in my Discord, I hope you'll keep this stuff in mind. I do feel like you all do make a good effort for these things. But to be blunt, I think it could be better, and I could do more to help with that. So I hope that this longer than usual parlay is useful as a way to address that. And I really appreciate it. Like there's something I didn't think I was going to get in my life, was getting to enjoy Buildcraft communities and discuss the meta, what I would consider the real meta. There might be perception, the real version of the game or whatever, and then the developer intent, but it sure does help if the people discussing those three things are like not talking past each other. So I really appreciate that. We have arrived at a place that no one has been before with many of these games, which is really exciting.